and fell apart. I hope we won't have that distraction either today. We're talking about some important matters. We're talking about human suffering. And we've pointed out the fact that all suffering is not because we have sinned. There are other reasons for our suffering. I read a story about a lady who had a setting hen. She wanted to raise some chickens, and she got a hold of a setting hen and was hoping she would hatch those eggs. Her husband was a hunter, and he went out hunting during that time, and he found a buzzard's nest. A buzzard was sitting on her nest, hoping to hatch some eggs, and he thought it'd be funny if I take a couple of those buzzard eggs home and put it under my wife's setting hen. When they hatch out, it would be funny to see what she thinks about that. So he got a couple of those buzzard eggs, took them home, without her knowledge, put them under her setting hen. And the next day or two, he asked her how her eggs were doing. Have they hatched out yet? She said, no, I got tired of fooling with those things, and I cooked those eggs for your breakfast this morning. Sometimes we can reap what we sow, even though it's not in regard to sinful things. But it is true that we can sin and bring suffering upon ourselves. Last week, we began to talk about 4 underlying principles that help us to understand suffering. Now, when we understand why suffering is in the world, we can make an application of it to our situation and perhaps better understand why we suffer. Principle number 1 that we were discussing last week was the fact that God set into operation the laws that govern this world and the universe. And we have to have those rules. We couldn't live on earth without those rules, those laws that God set in operation. But sometimes those very laws can work together in such a way that they cause us to suffer. We talked about the fact that this business of gravity can hurt us, but it's helpful. We couldn't live here if we didn't have gravity. We talked about fire and the fact that our forefathers had to have fire to warm their bodies and cook their meals. We still need fire today. And then you think about the fact that there is sunshine and rain. They're good. We couldn't get along without them. Yet sometimes sunshine causes a drought, and rain sometimes causes a flood. Because of the natural laws, sometimes suffering comes to us. Now, sometimes we can interfere with the laws of nature and cause suffering to ourselves. God intends for the rain to fall on the ground and to be soaked up in the ground. But think about the fact that man has covered up so much of the earth, so much of the ground, with concrete roads and asphalt roads and driveways and foundations for houses. Think of the fact that much of the ground is covered with something so the water can't seep into the ground. What happens to it then? It runs off into ditches and streams and rivers, and they overflow. No one can say, why did God do this? We can't blame God for the fact that floods come when we cause it like that. Sometimes we can do that. Have you ever heard of the Johnstown flood? I think I mentioned it in a sermon not long ago. I'm not going to charge anything extra for mentioning it again because it illustrates a good point here. I had never known much about the Johnstown flood until I went up there to preach in a meeting. I preached in 3 meetings in Johnstown, and the first time I was there, a couple in the church gave us a tour, and he showed us that there were mountains all around Johnstown, Pennsylvania. It's like a big bowl, and Johnstown is down in the bottom of that bowl. And up in the mountain, there was a stream that came out somewhere and flowed all the way down through Johnstown. And there was a flat area up there in the mountains, and the rich men thought, we could make a lake up here, build our homes around this lake. So they built a dam to dam up that stream. It was an earthen dam, just built with dirt. And they stopped it up, and water couldn't flow on down, so it begins to build up. And they built a lake, and then built their fancy homes around that lake. But remember, it's an earthen dam. And in 1888, a great rain came. And the rain was not able to just fall up there in the mountains and soak into the ground. but it fell into that lake, and it just built the lake up more and more. Finally, that lake got up to the top of that earthen dam, washed over a little bit, and first thing you know, the whole earthen dam was gone. And all of that lake up there flowed right down into the city of Johnstown. 2,100 people died in that flood. So far as I can determine, more people died in that flood than in any other flood in America. Save that one of Noah, we don't know how many were here then. But you see, because that rain fell up there in the lake, it couldn't get down to the earth, built up the lake, washed down the dam down. All that water came down into Johnstown. I'm sure there were many people who were saying, why did God do this? Why did God allow us to die, suffer like this? But God didn't do that. Sometimes we interfere with the laws of nature, and the laws of nature sometimes bring floods, earthquakes like the one that happened this past week with 10,000 people dying. Sometimes the wind will work in such a way as to cause a tornado or a hurricane, but we couldn't live without these laws of nature. We would not want God to have made the earth without these laws. We couldn't live here without them. And yet these very laws sometimes account for some of the suffering that man experiences. Now, is that not clear? Isn't it true that we can suffer that way? Number two, there is the freedom of man's will. When God made man, He made him with the ability to choose. Sometimes man chooses the wrong thing. He can choose the good or he can choose the bad. Now this ability to choose lifts man above the animals. We're not animals. Animals don't have that ability to choose between right and wrong. They live by instinct. When a leopard gets up in the morning and he's hungry, he doesn't say, I need something to eat, but I can eat that man. I'm going to eat this deer. He doesn't reason like that. Animals don't have that ability. We have that ability. We can determine what we do. When God made man with the ability to reach the moon, He also gave him the ability to plumb the depths. Man can do great things like go into the moon, but he can also kill little unborn babies in abortion too. And he can do all sorts of things because he has that choice, that ability. So you see, sometimes suffering comes because we have that ability to choose, and we sometimes choose the wrong things. Now, sometimes we blame God when we choose the wrong thing. I read a story about a little girl about 5 years old. She had a little brother named Billy, about 4 years old. And on one occasion, the little girl said, "Mama, whip Billy." And Mama said, "Why should I whip Billy? What did he do?" The little girl said, "He broke the arm off my doll." And the mama said, "How did he break the arm off your doll?" She said, "When I hit him over the head with it, the arm broke off," you see. Now, we can understand that with little children. But those of us who are adults ought to reason better than that. We ought not to do things and bring suffering upon ourselves and then blame God with it. But sometimes we do that. I remember a lady used to come to see me when I was preaching in Atlanta at the building. She was not a member of the church. She didn't attend the services where I was preaching. I assumed that she was having troubles, and one day she was passing the building and thought she'd just stop in there and talk to the preacher. So the secretary brought her in to talk to me. She came several times over a long period of time. Every time she'd come in, she'd have some big problem. On one occasion, she came in talking about committing suicide. Somebody backed into her car down the shopping parking lot, and her refrigerator had gone out when the power went off. All of her food in the refrigerator ruined. And so she was talking about committing suicide. That's the type of thing she'd come in and talk about. The last time I saw her, when she came in to see me, she was crying uncontrollably. She was really hysterical. And it was a good while before I could get her calmed down enough to tell me what the problem was. When I got her calmed down, she said her husband was a pilot. He was piloting a small plane, and he was bringing in drugs from Colombia, South America, into the United States, illegal drugs. and his plane crashed down in South Georgia, and she blamed God for it. Why did God do this? Why did God bring this suffering upon me? But God didn't do that. He made that decision to bring those illegal drugs in with a plane, and little planes crash. Now, every plane that has brought in drugs has not crashed. Why didn't God cause all of them to crash? God didn't do that. Planes crash sometimes, and his happened to crash while he was bringing in illegal drugs. But she was blaming God for it. Now, we need to think carefully about this business of suffering and understand that suffering is in the world for several reasons. And one of them is the fact that we sometimes make the wrong decisions. We choose the bad instead of the good. And when we choose the bad, there are consequences that come. In spite of the charges of some people, God is not responsible for some or even most of the suffering that people experience. Much of it comes because man has made the wrong choices. Sometimes the decisions of man brings a great deal of suffering into the world. Much of it is simply because he's made the wrong choices. There was a woman who married a man that she didn't know very well, apparently. She married him and then found out that he was a tyrant. He beat her, he abused her, misused her. He caused her a great deal of suffering. And she was saying, why did God do this? Why did God allow me to suffer like this? But God didn't do that. God didn't choose that man for her to marry. She made that choice. So you see, sometimes our own decisions cause suffering, and we can't blame God with that. A drunk driver can run into a car with a young father and mother and a little baby in that car, and that little baby can be killed. There are those who would say, why did God do this? Or God took my baby, that type of thing. But God didn't do that. That drunk driver did it. Man sometimes makes the wrong decisions, and when he does, it brings suffering. So let us remember that man's decisions sometimes cause suffering. Now, are you in agreement with me on these? I believe that's true. Number 3, the third underlying principle is the fact that there are imperfect conditions in our world. Now, we sometimes would like to think, I wish God would remove all the suffering in the world. Never have any imperfect conditions at all. Suppose he did that. He can't do it under the circumstances, but suppose he could do that. Think of all of the lessons that we would miss. Have you ever learned anything from some imperfect condition? Many times. We can learn lessons from those things that cause us suffering. Oftentimes, we learn things simply because something bad has happened to us, and it causes us to realize we need God. We need to depend upon Him. You think about that natural disaster last week in which 10,000 people died in that earthquake. Can we learn anything from that? We can learn that life is uncertain and that life is brief. When you see those things that kill a lot of people like that, or even one person, you can learn that we need to be prepared to meet God at any time. You don't know when that hurricane or tornado is going to come or when an earthquake will come. And so it can teach us we need to do something about our condition. Be ready at any time. Life is uncertain. We don't know what tomorrow will bring. Sorrow and suffering sometimes teach us great lessons, not just those we've mentioned. Turn to James 1 and verse 3. James 1, verse 3. James said, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience." I wonder how many of us ever rejoice because we've fallen into diverse temptations. That's a hard lesson to learn, isn't it? Do we ever say, Lord, I'm thankful you gave that temptation to me or that suffering. It's a difficult thing for us to do. But James says there are some things we can learn. Knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. It can cause us to learn to be patient. Now, patience is one of those lessons that we need to acquire. Remember when Paul talked about the fruits of the Spirit? But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering. That's patience, really. Gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. Galatians 5:22 and 23. Patience or long-suffering is one of those lessons that we need to develop to be fit to go to heaven to live with God. What else can suffering teach us like that? Can it cause us to depend upon God and realize we need God? It certainly can. That's one of the great lessons suffering can teach us. Now, if we went through life and we had no troubles, no problems, no heartaches or sorrows, have everything we need, we'd have a tendency to think we can make it on our own. We don't need God. But when some heartache or sorrow or suffering in some way comes upon us, it teaches us we can't do it on our own. We need God. We need to depend upon Him. Now, there are a number of lessons like that that can really be helpful to us in preparing us to go to heaven. You remember that Paul had that thorn in the flesh? He prayed about it 3 times, asking God to remove it, but God said no in every case. That, in essence, is what he said. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, he talked about that. And then in verse 9, and he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. What did Paul mean by that expression? For when I am weak, then am I strong. What did he mean? Right. When we're weak, we can't handle it by ourselves, we turn to God. And then we're strong. Paul said in Romans 8:31, if God be for us, who can be against us? Doesn't matter who's on the other side if God is for us. So when we are weak, when we suffer in some way, it causes us to turn to God, and then we are strong. So the Bible teaches that some suffering can help us to grow. It can help us to prepare for heaven. Some time ago, I read a book that contained 2 or 3 authors. Harold Hazlitt was one of them. The book is entitled, Anchors for the Asking. Brother Hazlitt used to be the president of Lipscomb and dean of Harding Graduate School and one of the speakers on the Herald of Truth. And he said, experience confirms that we can grow through suffering. People who remain faithful under trial do not merely survive, they deepen and broaden their lives. In 1973, Orville Kelly learned that he had inoperable cancer. He learned that he was going to die. Doctors can't do anything about it. He responded by forming a club. He called it the MTC. That stands for Make Today Count. And he began to try to live every day in a way that was good and right, wholesome. Make today count. He lived 10 more years. And before he died in 1982, he reflected upon his life. He said, I wouldn't wish my cancer upon anybody. But if I had to choose between a life without cancer and the quality of life that I've enjoyed since I have had cancer, I would choose the cancer. You see, suffering can help us. There was someone who tried it and said, I'd rather have a life with the cancer, with all the good things that it brought to me. Suffering sometimes can be good for us. And we ought not to become upset with God because we suffer, but we need to look into it and see how we can use it. Not why it happened, but how. How can I use it to serve God and prepare for heaven? How does a teenage boy prepare to play football in the fall? Does the coach say, now, this summer, I want you to lie in the shade in a hammock, eating ice cream and drinking tea or lemonade all summer? Is that how he prepares? No, no. Cutting grass, raking leaves, painting a fence, working, exercising. It is through exercise that he builds his strength. That's true physically. It can be true morally and spiritually. When I lived in Deer Creek in Montgomery, we had an exercise room. And I went down there occasionally. Sometimes I jokingly said, as I described my exercise routine, I get up in the morning and run 6 times around the block. Then I kick the block back on the bed and go back to bed. That's about my exercise. But there were times when I'd go down to that exercise room, and they had 17 pieces of equipment in there that you can use to exercise and build your strength. Most of them I couldn't do. Some of them, were really hard to do. This thing in which you were pumping that thing and stepping up and down on, I could last about a minute on that thing. That was it. I chose the treadmills. I walked about 3 miles per hour for about 30 minutes. But then there were some others walking on treadmills in there in which they were running. They were really running. They must have been running 8 or 10 miles per hour. And we'd have a little conversation, and I'd ask them, are you exercising for your health, or are you planning to run in a race? And usually they would say, I'm exercising to run in a marathon. Now, a marathon was approximately 26 miles. I wouldn't even want to walk that far. They were running. Really running. How do you prepare to run in a marathon? Do you run until you get tired and then quit? You run until you get tired and you begin to hurt and you keep on running. What's that expression? No pain, no gain. You have pain, and that helps you to build your muscles. It's true morally, spiritually, as well as physically. People sometimes build themselves up by suffering and overcoming the suffering. Every time you overcome some disappointment, heartache, or sorrow, you're stronger and better prepared for the next one. We don't want to pray and ask God, take away all of our suffering, Lord. We don't want to suffer at all. I don't think that's what we want, really. No pain, no gain. Back during the Depression, I read this story in a bulletin. I've read a lot of church bulletins in my day. And when I was working full-time as a preacher, I had bulletins coming from all over. And I found that the most prolific writers of articles for church bulletins are Brother Selected and Brother Adapted. You'll catch on to that tomorrow, maybe. People put articles in the bulletin, they'll say Selected or Adapted, not Brother so-and-so and so-and-so. Joe Barnett was one of the writers who did a lot of writing. And he told about a man back during the Great Depression. None of you are old enough to remember that. I came along near the end of that depression. I lived in a depression all my young life. At that time, this man lost his job. Many people lost their jobs during the Depression. He lost his savings, lost his home, lost his job, couldn't pay for his house, and he lost it. And to add to all of that, he lost his wife. His precious wife died. And all he had left was his faith, and his faith was weakening. He went out searching for a job, and jobs were scarce as hen's teeth during that time. And he came by the construction of a church building. There were workers there shaping pieces of rock to put up on the front of that building as decoration. And he noticed one man chiseling a piece of rock into the shape of a triangle. And he didn't see where it would go up there. And he asked the man, where are you going to put that? He said, you see that spire up there at the top? That little vacant place below it? That's where this rock is going to go. I'm shaping it down here so it will fit up there. As that man left that job, looking for another job, he thought about that statement, and tears came to his eyes. I'm shaping it down here so it will fit up there. And he thought, maybe that's why I'm suffering like this. Maybe all of this suffering is shaping my life down here so it will fit when I get up there to heaven. That can be true. Our sufferings here can help us prepare to go to heaven. And so we need to realize that when suffering comes, it is not always something bad. It can be something good. There can be heartache, sorrow, trouble of all sorts. But if we look for it, there can be a lesson in it. Use it properly. It can strengthen us and help us prepare for heaven. Well, would we agree with that? I want to emphasize that a little more, though, because I think this is at the very heart of our sufferings. We've never learned how to deal with suffering. We just lose our patience with God and we say, why did God allow this? When we need to pause and look for the lesson in it and see how I can use it to serve God. We need to remember that suffering can help us. Do you remember that the psalmist said in Psalm 119, verse 71, it is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes. What does that mean? He had suffered apparently, and the suffering had apparently led him to learn more about God's will. Remember the lady we talked about last week who was hurt with a head cracked in 200 places or more? Through all of that suffering, she learned more about God's will, became a great teacher for ladies' classes, ladies' day programs, and the like. It is good for me that I've been afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes. Sometimes suffering can lead us to God and to His will. It can lead us to the Bible. And faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. What can it do for us? Can suffering cause us to overcome the sin of pride? It could, couldn't it? If everything is going well, if I'm enjoying life, everything is good, no problems, no heartaches or sorrows, and I'm prospering, isn't there a tendency for us to depend upon self and to think, I must be pretty good? But you see, suffering can help us overcome pride. We mentioned Paul a while ago and the fact that he had those times when he prayed to God and asked Him to remove the suffering, and God didn't do it. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, in that context, he said, and lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. Paul received a number of revelations. He wrote more books in the New Testament than anyone else. He could have been filled with pride. I must be a pretty good fellow. I must be all right because I've received all these revelations. But when he received that thorn in the flesh, he realized that he was not perfect and that he could not control some things and that he needed God. God was teaching him a great lesson. Affliction sometimes helps us to overcome our pride. If you suffer, it makes you realize you can't do it on your own. When suffering comes, you may not be able to see how you can overcome it. And you turn to God. Affliction opens the ear. We learn a lot of lessons from Job. In the book of Job, chapter 36, verse 15, in the New American Standard Version, we read, He delivers the afflicted in their affliction, and opens their ear in time of oppression. We might have a tendency to overlook that passage with a lot of other things in the book. What does he mean? He delivers the afflicted in their afflictions. God can help us. He can see us through the afflictions. And then that last part, and opens the ear in time of oppression. What would that mean? Does suffering ever cause us to sit up and take notice? It does indeed. Oftentimes, when we suffer, it causes us to think, I need to think about what I'm doing, think about God and spiritual things. In my work as a preacher, and I'm sure that's true of these other preachers, we have run across folks who didn't seem to be too concerned about their souls and doing right until something bad happened. And then they were willing to listen. Let me tell you a story from Leroy Brownlow. Now, Leroy Brownlow was a great gospel preacher, and for a time he preached for the largest congregation west of the Mississippi River in Fort Worth, Texas. And he was a great man, great preacher. I've heard him preach in person. I've read his books for many years. He has written many great books. His most famous, I guess, is Why I'm a Member of the Church of Christ. Well, he grew older, and the congregation there where he was declined somewhat. People moved out to other areas, and they moved that congregation to another spot. I'm not sure at what point Brother Brownlow retired, but he retired and still worshiped with that congregation. And somewhere along in there, they invited a up-and-coming young preacher, fine young preacher, to come and preach for them. You may have heard about him. His name is Scott Glees. He came to preach for that congregation, and those folks had been used to some good preaching with Leroy Brownlow. But I'm saying that's why they asked Scott to come. I can say that because he's my favorite son-in-law. I want you all to know that. He came there to preach. We were visiting with him one time in that congregation, and we saw Brother Brownlow there. He was a member there for a long time. I say all that to introduce him to you. He was a man who had great wisdom, did a lot of good teaching. He wrote an article I want to share with you because it teaches a great lesson, I think, and illustrates what we're saying. Now, sometimes people have to suffer before they ever listen to God. He wrote an article entitled, Hats Off to the Rattlesnake. He tells a story about a family of wayward church members, a father and 3 sons. And once they were active, but now they were indifferent. And everything within reason had been done to restore them to faithfulness. One day while working, a large rattlesnake bit John, one of the sons. The doctor was summoned, and he came and pronounced that son's condition as grave. He observed about the only thing left was prayer. Immediately the preacher and the elders were called, and the preacher was asked to pray for John's recovery. He did, sort of. This is a tongue-in-cheek prayer that Brother Brownlow wrote. O wise and righteous Father, we thank Thee that Thou hast in Thy wisdom sent this rattlesnake to bite John in order to bring him to his senses. He has not been inside the church house for years, and it is very doubtful that he has in all of this time until now felt the need for prayer. Now we trust that this will prove a valuable lesson to him and that it may lead to genuine repentance. And now, O Father, wilt Thou send another rattlesnake to bite Sam, and another one to bite Jim, and another big one to bite the old man. We have been doing everything we know for years to restore them, but to no avail. It seems, therefore, that with all our combined efforts, it could not do, this rattlesnake has done. We thus conclude that the only thing left that will do this family any good is rattlesnakes. So, Lord, send us bigger and better rattlesnakes. Well, I can't verify the truthness of that, but it teaches a good lesson, I think. Sometimes suffering will cause us to turn to God and listen. I believe that's what that passage means in Job. Sometimes He opens the ears by allowing us to suffer in some way. Pain sometimes is good. If you'll pardon the personal illustration, I'd like to tell you that I learned that. When I was still preaching full-time down in Wildwood, Florida, began to have a little trouble, went to a doctor, and they wanted to do a heart cath on me. So a little old Chinese doctor did a heart cath and said you need to have 3 stents put in. So they put me into the hospital, carried me into the operating room, intending to put in 3 stents, and she put in 4. Brought me back into the recovery room, and by that time I was awake, and Mackie was able to come into the recovery room, and I was agonizing in pain in my chest, writhing in pain. She went to tell the nurse in charge in the recovery room about it, and the recovery nurse said, well, it's all right, he's all right. And Mackie came back to me, and I was still writhing in pain. After 2 or 3 trips to that nurse, she said, okay, well, we'll give him an EKG. She gave me an EKG and said he's having a heart attack. And that was what all that burning sensation was about, like very serious indigestion. They took me back into the operating room and put in 4 more stents and cleaned out the arteries. And so I had 8 stents put in that day. Now, I was hurting, writhing in pain when I felt that burning sensation. But I'm glad I had it, I'll tell you that. I wouldn't be standing before you right now if I had not had that pain. Had the same thing to happen when I was worshiping in Eastern Meadows after retiring. Same thing. I was having a heart attack. But pain sometimes is good for us. Now, right at the time, you don't enjoy it too much. But later you see that pain can be good for you. So we don't want to ask God to remove all of our pain because sometimes it's good for us. Pain sometimes warns us of danger. Affliction is often just a stepping stone to success. How many people have you known who became successful because they had some problem, some physical problem, and that problem caused them to put forth greater effort, and they did great things? I read about a little boy and his younger sister who were trying to climb up the side of a mountain, and it was very rough. Finally, the little sister said, I want to go back down. This is just a hill with a lot of bumps on it. And her brother said, the bumps are the things you climb on. Now, sometimes true in life. There's some bumps in life, some difficulties, heartaches and sorrows. But it's those bumps that we climb on. We can become stronger if we overcome them and turn to God for His help. Do you remember the Boll Weevil Monument down in Enterprise, Alabama? My first full-time work as a preacher was in Enterprise. The church building was on College Avenue. It ran north and south, near downtown. And then Highway 84 ran right through the middle of town and crossed College Avenue. And right there in the middle of College Avenue and 84 was a monument. It's like one of these roundabouts. You have to go around something in the middle. There was a monument to a pest, the boll weevil. And I wondered, why would you erect a monument to a pest like that? And then they told me. They used to raise cotton in that area. That was the king then. But then the boll weevils learned where the cotton was, and they came in there, and they'd eat up the cotton. And they would make very little money raising cotton. So they decided they'd have to turn to another product. They turned to peanuts. And that became the peanut capital of the world. They made much more money, were more successful, when the boll weevil caused them to turn to peanuts. Now, Sessions Peanut Company was between our church building and that monument. And I've seen trailer loads of peanuts waiting to unload there. They raise a lot of peanuts in that area. And so they honored the boll weevil because he caused them to turn away from cotton and to raise peanuts. Sometimes suffering can help us. It might cause us to go another direction. It might cause us to turn to God, and we can find help there that we would not have found otherwise. Suffering sometimes helps us. Paul's imprisonment, I think, is an illustration to that. You remember that Paul had been arrested. The Jews were about to kill him, and the Romans arrested him and saved his life, really. And Paul said, I appeal to Caesar. So they sent him to Rome. And even on the way to Rome, he suffered shipwreck. And were it not for God's providence, Paul would have died with 275 or so others. He was taken to Rome and imprisoned there. According to history, a prisoner would be chained to a guard. And he would be chained to him for 4 hours. They changed guards. Now, when Paul wrote to the church in Philippi, in Philippians 1 and verse 12, in the New American Standard Version, he said, Now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. How could that be? Paul was in prison when he wrote that passage. You know, we think that Paul was chained to a guard. At the same time, the guard was chained to Paul. Could you imagine Paul being chained to a guard for 4 hours without talking to him about Christ? No, he would. And some of those guards obeyed the gospel. So in the book of Philippians, next to the last verse, Paul referred to the saints in Caesar's household. How were there saints in Caesar's household? Paul's imprisonment enabled him to teach some of those people that he probably would never have had an opportunity to teach. Saints in Caesar's household could be attributed to the fact that Paul was a prisoner in Rome. So you see, sometimes suffering can turn out to be good. And so we need to learn how to deal with it. Go to God and ask for God's help and encouragement, and He can see us through. I have emphasized the fact that nowhere does the Bible teach us that a Christian will never suffer. It says he will suffer. And the man who wrote this passage that I have been mentioning in every class, and I suppose I will throughout this quarter, Romans 8:28, Paul said, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to His purpose. God is able to take everything that happens to us and make it work together for our good. That's the promise you have as a Christian. You are not promised that you'll never suffer. It says you will suffer. Yea, and all that live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. 2 Timothy 3:12. But the Bible does promise that God will see you through. The storms will come, the winds may blow, the floods may rise, but God will make everything work together for good. That's the promise that we have as Christians. Our time is about up right now. There's one other underlying principle that we want to talk about, and we'll begin there next week. Let me pause and ask you if you have any comments, anything you'd like to say. All right. Good to have you with us. Come back and be with us next week.